It's my pleasure to introduce today my guest, Dr. Eri Mulder. If you've spent any time on an AWC sanctuary, there's a reasonable chance you've met a remarkable ecologist by the name of Dr. Eri Mulder. And if you have met Eri in the bush, you've probably also shared some memorable close-up encounters with a range of frogs, bats, and reptiles. Since joining AWC in 2007, Eri has spent thousands of nights camped under the stars, leading wildlife surveys to track ecological health across our network of protected areas. From pythons to possums and ghost bats to bandicoots, Eri has caught, weighed, and measured them all. And speaking to us today from Wongalara, a big welcome to Eri.
Hi, Joey.
So you're at the homestead at Wongalara, and can you
Yeah,
describe what's behind you there? What's the
I
scene for you?
am. So I'm here on Rembunga and Nyallakan country. And so the house here at Wongalara, you can see, has an amazing vista, beautiful vantage point where you can see most of the eastern part of the sanctuary. So lovely spot for the sanctuary managers there. Sit out on their veranda and keep an eye out on, storms and weather this time of the year, but, good for fire spotting at other times of the year.
Very good. Lovely setting. Half your luck
Yeah.
to be there on this
Yeah.
Tuesday
Pretty
afternoon.
special.
Eri, we've got a lot to cover because you've been knocking around AWC for a long time.
Yeah.
So let's start at the very beginning. What was your background and how did you first come across AWC?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time, in my childhood growing up all around Australia, a lot of time in Northern Australia in the Kimberley, Cape York Peninsula, and through central deserts and western deserts, traveling with my family. And, that continued right up until I was at university, which was in central Queensland. But then I undertook my PhD at Fog Dam, which is 60 k's east of Darwin. So, a lot of fun in tropical ecosystems there, chasing snakes and rats around a floodplain and avoiding crocodiles and buffalo. But then, I handed my PhD thesis in, and as is a usual situation for a lot of students, was like, I need a job. I'd like to not live as a student anymore. And the interp officer position at Mornington was advertising at the time. And so I thought, yeah, that sounds like a great place. It's about as far from where I am right now in Rockhampton. And yeah, it's out in the, wild places that I was familiar with, and it just seemed like an amazing opportunity. I didn't have any prior knowledge of AWC. It was quite small at the time in 2007. Like that was around the beginning of the expansion in the Kimberley. And so, yeah, I handed my thesis in, and 2 weeks later, I was driving into Mornington.
It's a pretty good place to start your journey with AWC, and that will be
Yeah.
familiar for a lot of people, not just staff, but supporters as well, who have spent time in that very special landscape of the central Kimberley along Martuwarra, Fitzroy River, and surrounds. It was very different in 2007 to what's there now. It's a major science hub and infrastructure hub for AWC now.
Yeah.
But what was it like if you cast your mind back to 2007 and what work was going on there?
Well, it was, so I was joining a hospitality team essentially, so the visitor side of things. But, there's a lot of crossover between science teams and ops teams with, everybody had to sort of do a bit of every job. And so there was a lot of opportunity in between the interp stuff to be, out on fauna surveys. And of course, that's a seasonal role that ends as the wet season approaches. And so that was, where it could roll into research projects. The Purple Crown Fairy Wren project was running even at that time. It's one of the AWC's longest running research projects. That's, amazing collaborative exercise that goes on there. And it was really a science team run by Dr. Sarah Legg and Dr. Steve Murphy, where they were undertaking inventory of the properties as such, along with these really focused research projects on things like, what happens to particular species when you burn at different times of the year, what happens to feral herbivores if you remove them. The Gouldian Finch project was happening at that time, trying to look at the health of finches. And so, a lot of that work in 2007 and 2008 that I was involved in is the foundation of, my knowledge of northern savanna ecosystems.
Mm. And not just your knowledge, but it also sort of set the foundation for AWC's approach when it comes to managing tropical savannas in the Kimberley
Yeah,
and more
absolutely.
widely, yeah, right
Yeah.
across northern Australia. And fire management too. You mentioned EcoFire was getting started,
Yeah.
which has led to this incredibly successful program of burning now, focused in the Kimberley, subject of an earlier webinar this year.
Yeah.
Um, I think your experience sort of is a bit similar to mine in that once you're in the door with AWC, there's always more adventures to be had. What came next for you after a season in the Kimberley in that interp role?
So, I was doing interp, and of course, that's where I met a lot of AWC supporters for the first time because we were, of course, everybody was very closely involved in hosting supporters there, and then we also had big volunteer programs with things like the annual finch census, and so I was involved in that again in 2008, which rolled into a project to translocate bridled nail tails between different fences at Scotia. And so I was at Scotia at the end of 2008 and then running the fauna survey there, doing the pitfalling. And then that rolled into a role as a wildlife ecologist in 2009. So I spent a year at Scotia, but that was negotiated on the proviso that I could spend most of winter still in the tropics because I'm not a cold adapted animal. And so, a year in the deserts was, pretty much enough for me. And so then that rolled into a job in the Northeast. So a lot of the Northeast properties were quite new. Some of them were a bit older, but there were some new acquisitions in that region of Queensland around that time. And so, I took on a role as a wildlife ecologist there.
What a great region to be based in. I know the
Yeah.
Northeast portfolio of sanctuaries,
Yeah.
as it was sort of constituted then, ranges from, Southeast Queensland subtropical rainforest up through, I guess, the wet tropics in Brooklyn, Mount Zero, which is that lovely crossover with dry sclerophyll forest and patches of rainforest as well, up to Cape York. And it even included Pungalina 7 emu in the Northern Territory on the Gulf. So that's a pretty good sort of stomping ground. Um, you were actually living in the Northeast as well at Mount Zero. What was that like living on sanctuary at kind of high altitude in among all the critters?
Yeah, amazing. And it's interesting because, that is still technically almost part of the northern savannas, but the altitude there means that you are in wet sclerophyll forest and rainforest. And so, the house that I was living in, we had a resident masked owl that was just hanging out at the bottom of the hill. And, there's leaf-tailed geckos on the trees. And like you go for a morning walk and you've got all those wet sclerophyll birds and you might have rifle birds and, all sorts of exciting species. But it just gives you that, really close relationship with ecosystems and, understanding what's happening on the property. And of course, at Mount Zero Taravale, it's always been the eternal hunt for the northern bettong, So the 8 years I lived there every year, like you're always just like, well, maybe if I go spotlighting tonight, I might see a northern bettong. But we solved that problem, of course, by building a fence.
They're there now. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, such a
amazing.
lot must have changed at these places in that period. I've got a photo of you from Mount Zero Taravale showing some of the drier country,
Oh, yeah.
but also showing, you know, a
Yeah, this
scenario
is the
that
classic reptile identification problem. So we caught two of them so we could do the demo. Here are the two lizards. This is, of
beautiful.
course, Varanus tristis and Varanus scalaris.
I'm sure everyone recognized them instantly, and the
Yes.
defining features. Yeah. Really diverse reptiles in Northern Australia, and you've got a particular passion. You've got a few particular passions, but
Yeah.
reptiles and herpetology is one. Yeah, I don't know, what's kind of led you into that fixation on reptiles in particular? We can talk about bats later as well. But what do you love so much
I mean,
about reptiles?
that's just been lifelong. Sometimes people just really, vibe with the particular type of species, and that's always been something I've been interested in. I think there's a photo of me aged about 5, just casually taking a python off someone at a wildlife park. And yeah, I find them fascinating. They're especially, it's just a general interest when you're young, but then, as I got older and, through a science degree and more formal education, the level of adaptation, particularly in Australia, and radiations of things like skinks. There are no other places in the world that are that diverse for those groups. And also we know basically nothing about lots of them, evidenced by things like just last year, there's a description of a new Larista, which is a type of legless skink from Pangolina 7 emu. Like there's still amazing things to be found. And yeah, and also they live in really cool places.
Yeah, convenient.
Yes.
In fact, there's been a few sort of exciting discoveries or new detections of species for Western science, at least at sites where you've been running surveys. And I
Yeah.
don't think that's a coincidence. I think, just the number of trap nights you must have run across some of these
Yeah.
sites is phenomenal. And Pangolina is such a special property for that kind of thing because it sort of sits between the relatively well-studied wet tropics of North Queensland and again, relatively well-studied area of Arnhem Land. But in the Gulf of Carpentaria, there is a bit of a knowledge gap. And I remember on one of my first trips to Pangolina when you were there, we found this incredible and beautiful velvet gecko.
Yeah.
So there has been sort of real moments of discovery like this in your
Yeah.
work.
Absolutely. And that's sort of, that's a lot of these things, as you said, they're new to Western science. And, the traditional custodians, Aboriginal peoples of those areas, they know about these species, but then, it takes a lot of time for that process of Western science in terms of taxonomy and things. And so, we'll see things and think, oh, that looks like it might be a little bit different. And then, you go through the process. And that's often very collaborative. That's a huge part of, AWC managing these pieces of land in these very remote areas. We may not have the capacity to do the actual taxonomy, but we have really good connection with academic institutions to be able to have people, provide samples or provide information so that can all be catalogued and we can have the information we need for conservation of those species. That species in the photo was recognized as its own unique thing that only lives in that sandy Gulf area not long after that photo. And so, yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's real discovery to be had at some of these
Yeah.
places. Tell us a bit more about Pangolina 7 Emu. I've got very fond memories of the landscape there, which it's quite unique. It's different to, well, it's got elements in addition to the sort of tropical savanna that is sort of consistent across the north. Tell us a little bit about the special features of that landscape, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, it's absolutely unique, as even within AWC's entire estate that we manage, because it's one of only two properties where there's coastline. The other, of course, being Foray Island, which is an island. And that is a key reason, why the sublease of 7 Emu was negotiated for conservation, because there's these incredible, very remote, very unimpacted landscapes along the coast. And it sits in a sort of north-south orientation in the bottom of the Gulf of Carpentaria. So you have a vegetation gradient, which is, of course, driven by rainfall gradient, and it goes from amazing coast into sand dunes, which have palm forests in the dune swales, and then across open clay pans and salt flats that support migrating shorebirds, and then into savanna, tall Darwin stringy bark forests, a sandy understory that have all these amazing wildflowers and thick grass and like lots of bandicoots. And then right down in the southern part, you've got deep sandstone gorges and spinifex and big rivers, and then limestone springs. So there's limestone karst country there that has a big cave network and all of these amazing springs, which again support a different set of vegetation and fauna species.
Mm. Yeah, springs that bubble up out of the
Yeah,
sandstone
the
year
bubbling
round.
sands, which is like swimming around in an aquarium. Yeah,
Amazing.
it's
Right
fantastic.
through the dry season as well. And those caves are really interesting. You know, having a cave network
Yeah.
as part of one of our sanctuaries is really cool. Home, of course, to lots of different species of bats. Another.
Absolutely. And some of the most exciting ones, the nationally listed vulnerable ghost bat lives there, and it's one of the very significant populations left in Australia because that species has declined. So there's a maternity cave there. So, you know, a significant breeding population. And so, protection of the land around those actual caves is critical to the survival of that species. And so it's amazing to have that actually on the property.
Hmm. So there's the sort of baseline, I guess, eco health surveys that are run each year or every other year or at regular intervals across each of our sanctuaries. And that's made up a lot of the survey work that you've been a part of. There are also targeted surveys for particular groups, and you've done a lot of the surveys for bats, not just
Yep.
in Northern Australia.
Yep.
And that's a very different type of work, I guess. You're surveying for nocturnal flying mammals that won't, walk into a pitfall trap. So tell us about some of the bat surveys that you've done.
Yes, that's been interesting. And it has sort of been opportunistic originally because bat survey is a particular skill set. And so you need specialist equipment and skills to be able to do it. But we generally use a combination of what are called harp traps and mist nets. And we had a big, I guess, series of bat surveys this year across Wongalara, Pungalina, Seven Emu, Brooklyn, and Picaninny Plains. And so another bat ecologist, Ollie Aylan, and I know many of you will have met Ollie, also holding a bat. We surveyed across all of those sanctuaries, and we had hundreds of meters of mist nets out. We put up mist nets in the canopy, so a series of ropes to get them up at treetop height at somewhere like Picaninny Plains, because there are high flying bats you can only catch at that height. We also use acoustic recorders, so recording ultrasonic calls of bats and then classifying them later. So it's a kind of acoustic version of a camera trap where we can monitor species remotely. We don't have to be there. And so we will end up, those targeted surveys will feed into the ecological health monitoring so that, we can keep track of which species are where on all of the sanctuaries, mainly by acoustics, but then there are some species where we will still have to go out and trap for them because we can't distinguish them acoustically. And so, it's a lot of late nights of going out into the bush and think like a bat, like where would I fly? Where would I go? And like all ecological work, you are spending your time trying to outsmart the animals and regularly failing, right? Like that's the deal, we are not the smartest by any sense in those landscapes. So we're just trying to do our best to be like, right, how can we find them and find out what they're doing in their secret everyday lives?
Yeah. This is a question without notice, but thinking of that sort of 18 years doing so many surveys and repeating surveys in the same places year after year, is there anywhere that you can point to a trend that's really, really visible, either in the data or just anecdotally, where you've seen the condition of a place change, improve, or populations of species change over that time period? And I know you're sifting through
Yeah,
about
yeah.
25 different countries.
Yeah, I mean, there are places where we've definitely seen quite dramatic changes, places like Bowra, which are in the semi-arid zone. And, I think also places like Picaninny Plains, which are really very productive ecosystems, but many, you may have seen has quite high mammal diversity.
Mm.
And also places in the Kimberley, where reduction of feral herbivores, improved fire regimes, all those things have led to, I guess, a bit of a rebound for small mammal populations. And that is what you're looking for. But, AWC tends to, our goal is to usually acquire land or undertake management where, it's in relatively good condition. And so what is also amazing to see is that where you see like stability in those populations, right? You don't want to see things declining. And, Mount Zero Taravale is like that. Aside from the northern bettong, it has one of the highest diversities of both macropods and small mammals. The faunal assemblages are essentially intact, and that is amazing to be able to go out, every time we survey and you're like, we're going to catch all of these different species. And yeah, like seeing an ecosystem that's functioning really well is, a wonderful thing.
Yeah. You've always managed to incorporate lots of fun side quests into your work, which have taken you to almost every AWC sanctuary and partnership site. There's a few exceptions to that, but I think you've probably seen more of the network than almost anyone else at AWC. Can you run us through some of those sort of side quests to other regions and other parts of the AWC network?
I've been, so fortunate in that sense. Sometimes it's sheer luck, having a skill set. For instance, that's how I ended up at Scotia, because I'd worked with bridled nail-tailed wallabies before I came to AWC. And so it's like, well, I have a skill set that we can use for a particular project. And so that's led to things like, well, your honours project, Joey, where we went to Artesian Range to, look at ecology and, band sizes for black grass wrens. And so, that's just a fantastic, incredible place. And so, in the same instance, we had a PhD student, Dr. Rosie Honan, who was working on scaly-tailed possums and golden-backed tree rats. And, she was unable to get out to try and catch her last collared animal. So I got that job, not a terrible time at all. So, we're out there trying to trap a single animal only to be, kind of derailed by having too many quolls. It's like, what a problem. We have too many quolls. We have to take them all out of the traps and put them in temporary jail and then reset all the traps. And then the second time round, you're catching possums and monjon and Kimberley rock rats and golden-backed tree rats. So those types of research projects are amazing. We've also been involved in other projects which aren't so great, but, are very, aligned with AWC's values in terms of the Black Summer bushfires, where I coordinated a whole round of immediate post-fire surveying for both on Kangaroo Island and for another conservation organisation, because they did not have the resources. And that was around the, 8-day construction of the Kangaroo Island critical refuge fence. And so that sort of, those sort of surveys and work is, it's incredibly hard work, but it's also amazing, incredibly rewarding to see, Pat Hodgins and Joe Schofield, like just coming together from the New Haven fence and at Western River Refuge. And you can put a fence up in 8 days while we're, monitoring the Kangaroo Island Dunnart every day. And you're like, yep, they're still here. They're still here. Yeah.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
I asked you when we were preparing for this whether there was a species that had sort of appeared unexpectedly, and again there was lots to choose from, but
Yeah.
you named the chameleon dragon as one of the sort of surprise finds from one of the sites you've done. I think you've seen them at a couple of sites actually. Tell us why you were so excited to find a chameleon dragon.
I mean, these lizards are just, they're just fascinating, right? We know essentially nothing about them. We don't know how to find them. There are lots of theories that people will try, but there is no consistency in success of using those methods. And so a lot of them, you just see them incidentally. They'll be crossing a road, or you'll catch one out of the corner of your eye driving. And, as Joey said, we've seen them at a number of sites. They're at Mornington Marion Downs, and they're, at Bullow River, they're at Pungalina Seven Emu. But there's a particular survey at Pungalina where we looked in a pitfall trap, and here's a chameleon dragon just like sitting on top of a little pile of dirt in the bottom. And it's just like, what? Like, you guys are meant to live in trees and I don't know, climb around and be in the sand. And here you are. And so they have showed up in a few interesting places because also recorded them on camera trap in the Rocky Gorges at Bullo. And I was sort of like, is that definitely one in the camera trap image? Because we didn't think you lived there either. And so, yeah, they're fascinating and they are unique. They're in their own genus. And yeah, I'd love to know more about them, but they're just so hard to find.
Yeah. How good. Eri, it's been a real pleasure working with you in the field over the past decade or so that I've been hanging around, and a privilege to spend so much time with you in wild places. And that's why I'm very sad to let people know that after 18 years at AWC, the time has come and you're moving on to explore some new places with a very exciting research project. Can you tell us about your next adventure?
Yes, I am also very sad to be leaving, the incredible places of AWC and, all the people who have both taught me so much and that I've had the privilege to work with. But yeah, I'm going island hopping. So Charles Darwin University has a biodiversity and safe haven project. It's an Australian Research Council grant to survey majority of the islands off the Northern Territory coast for both native species and invasive species so that'll be working primarily with all of the traditional custodians of those islands and trying to work out what lives there and the capacity for those places to act as island arcs in the future.
How exciting. I
Yeah.
do hope you'll need some assistance with fieldwork on those Northern Australian islands. And, that's sort of bringing to bear the decades of fieldwork of experience that you've had with AWC and elsewhere. And, it's, again, a project with real conservation application. So, I can't think of a more exciting next adventure for you. But of course, we'll miss you very much. We're very grateful for the legacy that you leave at AWC.
Yeah. Thank you, Joey.
Well, that just about finishes it up. I really do ache just thinking about all the pitfall holes that you've dug and trenches that you've dug in various landscapes, and all the
Keeps you fit.
records. That's right. All the records of rare and threatened species that you've logged, from all of us at AWC. Thank you very much. We'll miss you. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to hear from Eri as she wraps up an extraordinary 18 years at AWC. What a legacy. Through Eri's work, you get a sense of the sheer scale of our EcoHealth program, which involves hundreds of thousands of trap nights across millions of hectares every year. This is the backbone of our science program. It allows us to measure the impact of our conservation work across Australia. And when you make a donation to Australian Wildlife Conservancy, you're supporting work like this, gathering crucial information about how our ecosystems are going and the difference that our conservation programs are making. Thank you, everyone, for your support in 2025. It's been a huge year, and there's lots of good stuff still to come next year and beyond. We will be back. Until then, have a very Merry Christmas. Thanks.